Welcome. Thanks for coming after lunch. Hopefully I can keep some of you awake. So I'm going to be talking, I'm kicking off the multimodal session, but I'm just talking about speech. So I'm going to start out with a little bit of a explanation of what I mean by multimodal and why perhaps you should be interested in it, even though I'm only going to be talking about speech. And then I want to talk about the core part of this presentation, which is 3 ideas for using prosody and spoken language processing. And that's going to be one of the modalities that we're interested in. And finally, I'll conclude with open questions. OK, so most of the time, most of you probably think, when we think about modalities, you tend to associate it with sensors. So for example, audio is a modality and video is a modality. You might have images instead of video. You might have haptic input. One could think of text as a modality. And so multimodal research often is things like audio and video, audio and gesture, text and image, text and audio. But here, and I will actually be doing text and audio, but what I want you to think about is, for this talk, is that modality is an information channel. So different aspects of a signal from a particular sensor can convey different types of information. And to help you think about that, if you have a video and you want to analyze a video, if you were interested in doing speech recognition, you would be focused on the mouth movements and lips and stuff like that. If you wanted to know who the person was, you would tend to look at facial features. And if you wanted to know what their emotion was, are they engaged, are they paying attention, you would be looking at dynamics of the facial features. In audio, if you wanted to get the words that people say, then you're going to look at the short-term spectrum, because that's going to give you the phonemes that you put together into words. If you wanted to know the person, you're going to look at long-term averages of the spectral statistics. And if you wanted to get information about emotion or engagement, and here when I say engagement, I don't mean they're coming back. I mean they're actually interacting, and you could have a positive engagement because somebody's talking a lot, or being enthusiastic. You could be, just kind of so different forms of engagement. And there, what you tend to want to look at is modulation in pitch and energy. So we can think about spoken language as having a bunch of different types of information. So at the short time scale, there's things like words, filled pauses, breaths, maybe laughter. When you go down go up a little longer to the utterance scale, you've got constituent structure, focus, intent of the utterance. If you go a little bit bigger, you can get things like emotion, engagement. And then if you go even bigger, then you'll have information that's average across all of that that'll correspond to the speaker in the social context. On the feature side, if you think about signal processing, there's differences here in time scale that I just described. But there's also another type of difference, a way you can decompose the signal. And if you're somebody who's learned about speech, the first thing you learn about is this source filter idea. That the idea is your vocal track is like a filter, and your vocal cords or the air you're blowing, that's sort of like the source, and you're generating the speech. And those actually end up carrying different types of information. So the filter sort of stuff is going to carry spectral information that's useful for words and speakers. But the source stuff, how fast your vocal cords are vibrating, the fundamental frequency, the energy you put into it, the timing of when you do things, those sorts of things I'm going to refer to as prosodic features. And they're different signal processing, different ways of pulling out information from a signal. An oversimplistic alternative way of looking at it, or not alternative way of looking at it, but another type of signal would be AM radio. So with AM radio, you modulate by a carrier signal. The carrier signal tells you about the station, and the envelope of the signal is the information that's being transmitted. So depending on the information, you might need to do different approaches to pull information out of a signal. So in particular, the channel that I want to talk about that hasn't gotten a ton of attention from the understanding side is prosody. So prosody is not what you say, but how you say it. And so I grabbed a cartoon from the Language Log Archives. This is thanks to Mark Liberman. And in this case, prosody is the difference between saying something nice, like, why don't you look nice? Versus saying, why don't you look nice? And those are two very different things that could lead to grumpiness or versus a smile. Another example, one of my favorite examples, is single one-syllable words, like oh, yeah is another one, or okay, that's two syllables. But so the word oh could be said in a sort of disappointed way, oh. Or it could be said in an enthusiastic way, oh, like I get it. Wow, that's great. And those have very different meanings. If you want to actually understand language, these are differences that you want to get at. I will thank Jason for providing another example. So if I wanted to say, play one by U2, I would be emphasizing one. If I wanted to say, play one by the Beatles, I would be de-emphasizing it. And there's a very different amount of energy and intonation pattern associated with those two renditions of the word one. Okay. The clicker is not going. Okay. So there's a lot of different types of applications that you might want prosody for. And these are some examples of things that I've been looking at in the last couple of years. And so for starters, if you're doing a dialogue system, such as from the Alexa Prize, this is a social bot dialogue. This was a real example. Now, in the Alexa Prize dialogues, you need to talk about things. And when you're negotiating for a topic, sometimes a user will say, how about X? So in this case, the person said, how about robots? What's up with robots? So that's two sentences. But if you don't have the prosody and you just have the word string, and you're used to seeing how about X, then you get a topic that's robots, what's up with robots? And that is a topic that we don't know about, even though we know plenty about robots. Another example that was problematic for us in dialogues, not having access to the prosody, just having the words, is the word yeah. So you can say yeah in agreement. Or you could say yeah, meaning I don't really buy it. Or you can say yeah as a back channel and actually say no after that. It's just, yeah, I'm listening to you, but no, I think blah, blah, blah. So that is a cause for many mistakes if you're not paying attention to the prosody. More recently, I've been looking at child-robot dialogues and human-child dialogues for reading. And one of the things that you see, so in a lot of these virtual assistants and the social bots, there's a turn, you speak, there's silence, and then the bot knows to take a turn. But if you want to have a more human-like conversation, then you have to do turn taking. And so you have to figure out when to interrupt and when you interrupt, whether you should back channel to say, I'm listening, etc., or actually, for example, encourage the kid, so this kid's trying to read or you're reading, or ask the kid a question because they're not engaged. So those things are signaled by how the kid is talking, not just what they're saying, but how they're talking. So for example, if their intonation rises, that means they're not sure of themselves and they need encouragement. In call center data, one of the things that's quite interesting is the person on the call frustrated? Companies kind of want to know that because they don't want to lose their customers. In working with spontaneous speech, and this could be any sort of speech understanding, but things like translation or data mining or other things like that, one of the things you run into is disfluencies. So disfluencies are when you self-correct. So you repeat yourself or you self-correct. Things like I think, in this case, the stand they have, or the way they command respect. I support that. So the slashed out things in this example are words that the person is self-correcting. So disfluencies are actually quite normal in conversation. You don't think about it, but you do them all the time. And it's not just normal conversational, slobs on the street. It's everybody does this. And so in Supreme Court oral arguments, which is what the next example is, it would have to be, I would think a reasonable standard would have to be, those sorts of corrections are done by lawyers or judges in oral arguments where you want to make sure that you say exactly the thing you want to say. So these things happen in high cognitive load situations as well as just informal situations. And if you want to translate it or get the meaning correctly, you need to figure out what's to be thrown away and what's not. Okay, so I've just made the case that prosody has a lot to offer, but really nobody's using it. And we've been working on it for several years. And so why, I've been struggling with this question for a long time. And so the reason, I think, the big reason has been, when ASR is bad, the most important thing is to get the words. And so that's the first order effect. Now, more recently, that's getting better, and then the language processing becomes the second order effect. So prosody, for a lot of the applications that we've looked at on the understanding side, where it's just isolated sentences and things like that, it's more of a third order effect, so it's less important. A second reason is that it's really hard and not well understood. In that list of things that I gave you, all of these things end up affecting the prosody. The words affect the prosody because some sounds are longer than others. Emphasis affects the duration and the fundamental frequency. The constituent structure affects it. Emotion affects it. How do we disentangle all of those things? A standard approach has been, well, let's just do a bunch of statistics and throw a bunch of things at machine learning and see what we can learn. But then you have tons of data and you need lots of labeled data. We don't have that, so that's a little bit hard. And then the third reason that I've come to appreciate more recently is there's a substantial amount of redundancy between prosody and syntax. And the fact that there's this redundancy is why speech synthesis can be so good. That there's a lot of redundancy. You can predict a lot of prosody from the syntax. So then if there's all this redundancy and you get the words right, maybe you don't need it. I would argue that as our systems now get better, people talk to it more naturally. We expect more from it. We're doing more than single sentences now. And so it really is time to start revisiting these challenges behind using prosody, because ASR has gotten to be much better, though it is still not solved. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 3 ideas. One, We want to let neural networks learn the feature functions. We're not going to just throw a bunch of windows and normalizations at it. 2, we're going to think about normalization as broad contextual normalization, including the syntax. So we're going to take advantage of that redundancy or account for it. And then lastly, we're going to think about language processing as multimodal, where the prosody is one channel. You can have I'm going to use text as the other channel. That actually can be the spectral features that lead you to text. Okay, so the experiments that I'm going to talk about are going to be in parsing and disfluency detection, because these are areas where we know prosody should matter. There's linguistic studies. Disfluency is a prosodic disruption. And yet, in the last few years, with these really good neural network parsers and disfluency detectors, prosody doesn't help anymore. And so I wanted to see, in those situations, can I get it to help? All right. So let's start with a parser. So we're going to have a good neural parser, and now I'm going to add to it something that learns about prosody. So this is just one little piece. This is the little piece that's going to learn about fundamental frequency and energy, intonation, energy, modulation sorts of things. And so what we're going to do, instead of just saying I'm going to do averages and derivatives, I'm just going to learn these filters. I'm going to learn feature functions. And I'm going to use CNNs. I'm going to allow it to have different windows so I can get different time scales. And it's going to slide around the words so I can say, well, does it matter to be in the beginning or the end of the word? So I'm going to learn those things automatically. And then I'm going to concatenate those with other prosodic features, which is durations and pause durations. So word durations and pause durations, and those are going to be embeddings too. And then we've got word embeddings that are going to be input into the parser. That's a text. So I'll concatenate all of those, throw them into a parser, and do end-to-end training. Okay, so we did experiments in parsing switchboard, conversational speech. And there's a lot of views about prosody being a constituent thing, so we did constituent parsing as opposed to dependency parsing. In this particular problem, we are using hand transcripts and sentence boundaries. It turns out so that there's other issues with using ASR I'll get to at the end. And now, in the earlier work, we did an earlier parser and neural parser. In the most recent work, we've done a better parser because parsers have improved. And so our base parser was a self-attentive encoder and chart decoder. So the findings, and then what we did, because we wanted to have the best parser we could, we also threw in contextualized embeddings. So we tried both Elmo and Bert. And the interesting question is, you would think, well, they help everything, these contextualized embeddings. But there's a big mismatch here, because they're all trained on written text. And spontaneous speech is very different. It's got disfluencies, it's really informal. So will these embeddings help? In fact, they do. So they help quite a bit. So we got a really strong baseline. Does prosody still help? So we got prosody with a weaker parser, without any contextualized embeddings. And then we added contextualized embeddings. Then we improved the parser. And each time, prosody still helps. And so the great news is, with or without these embeddings, with the 2 different parsers we've tried, prosody still is helping. Now, it's not helping a huge amount. The win I got from the contextualized embeddings was bigger, but at least we're getting a gain. So it's learning something. And on top of it, we've gone from 85 F-score 2 years ago up to 93. So for switchboard spontaneous speech, that's pretty good. So if you look at where it helps with disfluencies, as you would expect. It also helps with verb phrase attachments, and then there's some other things. Depending on what embeddings you use, different things help. But the bad news is, so I got excited about that, and I said, OK, we're going to use the same thing for disfluency detection. Didn't help at all, okay? And we're still in the situation where the embeddings gave us the biggest thing. So we still, this isn't good enough. So that brings us to our next idea. Contextually normalized prosodic features. So the key idea here is we're going to actually take the word sequence and say, all right, what do I think the prosody should be? Okay, so in this case, was it, I mean, did you? That's there, what I think the prosody should be is kind of the default. Then I'm going to compare it to what I actually observed in the signal. And in this case, let's say there's a disfluency, a correction, and so you can see there's that big pause there. And I'm going to look at a relative difference and use this as my prosody features. So what I've got is, in fact, I'm not, I was a little bit misleading. When you get into the details, I'm not just predicting the prosody, I'm predicting a prosody distribution. Okay? And then, because I have a prosody distribution, I can subtract out the mean and divide by the variance. And so I can get this residual. It's not a residual, it's a normalized residual. And that turns out to be really important because in some places, you just have a lot of variances. There's a lot of ways you can say things, and so that's fine. You don't get too uptight if you see something unusual. So what we're trying to do is look for the things that are unexpected and unusual, because that's where we're going to carry information that complements what you get from the words. Okay, and we call this innovations. And so then we tried playing around with these in disfluency detection. And again, this is with switchboard. And the first thing we did is say, all right, if we just learn these prosody innovations, forget about, we use text to learn the innovations, but we're not going to actually use text. We're just going to see how does the prosody innovations alone help us with disfluency. So they're aligned with the text, so you kind of have that information, but we're not using the words, the pattern repeats, et cetera. And the really amazing thing, so the blue is how you would do with text. The yellow is what you would do with the raw features. And for as long as I've been working on prosody, which Alex unfortunately disclosed to you, we have been seeing results that look like that yellow thing. Well, if I only look at the prosody in parsing, or if I only look in the prosody for intent, or if I only look at the prosody for disfluencies, I don't get a lot. I get a little, but I don't get a lot. But now, actually, we get a lot because we're complementing, we're looking at the things that we're accounting for what's in the text. So we're looking at where things are unusual. We're looking at the anomalies. And so that was the exciting thing. And also, if you look at the distributions are doing precisely what we expect from our previous linguistic studies of the data, that we're going to have energy that's lower at interruption points. Things are longer because you're hesitating. So we're learning stuff that really makes sense. So that's great. Now, let's make it multimodal. So we're going to take this prosody innovation, and we're going to take the word sequence using our state-of-the-art neural net and put them together. And so we're going to think about this as, so in most of the work that's done before, you say, okay, here's the word vector, here's the prosody vector, concatenate them, treat it like it was a word, plug it all through. So now we're going to think about it, okay, it's multimodal. We don't have to actually do everything as a word. We can think about different types of fusion. So this is just the start, just one experiment comparing early versus late fusion. And basically what we find, as I showed before, if you use the raw prosody, you don't get very much. In fact, it hurts. But if you use the innovations, we actually get a win. If I do early fusion, it's not statistically significant. If I do late fusion, I actually get a real win. And to give some examples, now what's happening here is most things are actually, we start out with a very good baseline. So the things that we get with prosody are the hard things. So for example, what a disfluency detection system learns is if I repeat a word, it's a disfluency. But that's not always true. For example, this is a switchboard example, but it's just, leak, leak, leak everywhere. So that is not a disfluency. That is emphasizing the fact that I've got this stupid plumbing problem. Or one might say that as a disfluency very frequently, but it's also the case that you can say that in a fluent way. So people should know that that's an option, right? So the difference is when you say that versus that. And then the last example is an example of unusual emphasis. And this is just getting at not so much whether I got a disfluency correctly or not, but this is something for other applications. So what is really important here? I think you do accomplish more after that. Some things that we correctly got that the regular system missed. It is a perfectly fluent thing, but in this case, it's a disfluency. And disfluencies that are really long, we also get with the innovations, and we don't get them so much with language. This actually turns out to be important with the Supreme Court oral arguments because they have long disfluencies. Okay, so to summarize, the key things that I want you to walk away with are that ASR has really advanced, and so people expect more from these systems that they talk to, so they're going to talk to them in a more human-like way, so it's time to use more than the words. If you want to do an understanding and respond appropriately, it's time to start thinking about how to use prosody. Then the second point is just because we had a lot of trouble with prosody in the past doesn't mean that you should be skeptical. I really think there is great potential by looking at this as a multimodal process, factoring out, looking for what's complementary in one channel versus another channel in order to get, put your effort into the stuff that's going to give you more information. So that's the basic idea there. Now, this is really early stage work, and so there's a lot of things that can be improved. As I said early on, we started out assuming that the words were correct, and so that's the best case possibility. So we need to factor in speech recognition. The one interesting, hopeful part is that when we looked at, turns out Switchboard has some transcription errors. So where they have transcription errors, it turns out it looked like prosody hurt, and that's because prosody was actually working on the right words. And so, so there's the potential for prosody to help with errors, but we have to assess that. And there's issues with using current speech recognition systems that could be taken advantage of. There's also, the work we've done so far has an impoverished model of fundamental frequency, and so that's something that could be improved. So there's a lot to do there. There's also a lot to do in terms of thinking about multimodal architectures. We just really did the two simplest thing, early and late. So there's opportunity there. And then one of the things that I am kind of excited about and skeptical about at the same time is thinking about domain transfer. So as you heard from some of the talks this morning, when you change domains, you change the words, and that can mess up language processing. So when you change domains in speech, prosody, the words, people use prosody in the same way. Emphasis is emphasis, right? So those anomalies can come through. The tricky part, so there's the potential that prosody can help with domain transfer, but there's also the potential of running into trouble, and this is related to style. So one of the things we've looked at recently is what if we take red speech, parse red speech versus parsing spontaneous speech? We don't use prosody in the same way with red speech. And so it turns out there's more information in spontaneous speech in our prosody. But that actually is why if you're going to be more spontaneous in talking to users, if users are going to be more spontaneous, they will be giving you more information with prosody. But anyway, the style mismatch is an issue. And lastly, I think that prosodic anomalies, if you think about this as an anomaly model, okay, we're looking where things don't behave the way they're supposed to. There are some interesting applications where you could hopefully make an impact. And one of the areas we've looked at is literacy assessment. So can you understand not just if they're speaking slowly, that means they're less literate, reading slowly, they're less literate, but understand actually what is the issue in terms of where do they make the mistakes, where is the slowdown. And also medical diagnostics. And then there's other types of applications in terms of simulation and education as well. And so with that, I will stop and take any questions.
Thank you, Mari. Any questions from the audience?
Hi, thank you. That was fascinating. I had a question about the innovation, actually trying to compute that. You say you predict the prosody given the text. One of the features that's going to be predicted is the length of words and the timing and the gaps. How do you then do the alignment or sort of time stretching to see how those boundaries
So that is a good question. That was sort of one of my future work things. So in old days speech recognition, you do forced alignment, and you can get word times and phone times. In new day speech recognition, people don't do forced alignment. So there's ways you can use attention, and that's a research problem to look at. But I actually thought you were going to ask a different question, so no, it's not doing my backup slide. Oh well. But I should say when we're predicting things, we do, your standard word embeddings, go into a bi-LSTM, and that predicts a word thing. But then we take into account the word content. And so with the word content, we're actually predicting phoneme level distributions and things like that. So we are predicting those things. But right now, we're not actually using them because we only can reliably get word time alignment. So we only get word times.
Thank you. My question is in the context of many people who have autism struggle with prosody in the context of having themselves understood. Sometimes if prosody involves putting stress on a particular word in a sentence and they fail to put the stress at the right time, people misunderstand. So in the context of providing speech therapy, which was one of your future directions, can we think of prosody in shades of gray? Because as improvements come from speech therapy, it's not overnight. It's small increments until they reach the levels that typical speakers have. So my question is, when you have prosody detection, do you consider it as an on-off sort of concept or a continuous?
No, yeah, exactly. That's a really good point. So I used to, but what we're doing now really is looking at letting the text drive everything and predicting we're predicting this continuous number. And so what we'd be looking at is deviations from the expectation. And so you could look at, and it's all continuous. So you could look at things in terms of gradual progression.
Thanks.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was wondering if you have any intuition as to why late fusion is better than early fusion?
I suspect it's related to the problem, and this is not going to be true for all tasks. But it's getting at a broader window. So the prosody innovations that we have, we use the whole sentence to get our word embeddings, and then the word embeddings predict the prosody characteristics. And so it's got a lot of global context, but it's fairly local, and it may be that the late fusion is getting us a longer term context. I don't know. But that's a good question, and I should have a better answer, but I don't.
Thank you.
Let's thank Mari again.